Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 43 of PhotoKitchen. I am your humble host, MD Welch, and today on the menu, we're talking Adobe Lightroom Classic. We're talking the basics panel. We're talking about a total walkthrough. Now, I already have an image loaded into the develop module. You'll see that develop is highlighted in that lighter gray on medium gray motif that I love so much in Adobe Lightroom Classic. You got to love the gray on gray on gray. I have collapsed down the left column. I have collapsed down my film strip, not only for more room for you to be able to see what's going on, but also I just like having a cleaner interface when I'm in the develop module. In this particular video, we're only going to talk about the histogram panel and the basics panel. So if you're brand new to Adobe Lightroom Classic, you're in the right spot. If you've been using it for a little bit, but you're still wondering if you're using these tools correctly, you're in the right spot. And if you've been using the program for a while, I hope you stick around. Maybe I can give you a little tip or two to make your life easier. Now, before I dive into the panels themselves, one important little tip to give you, and this could be my top tip or my first secret tip of the video. And that is if you go to any panel and right click or control click, depending on how you have right click set up, you will get this little pop-up menu giving you the ability to show all, customize, that kind of thing. I highly recommend making sure that you're in solo mode, and you'll know you're in solo mode with that check mark. All that solo mode does is allow you to go from one panel to the other. And when you click on, say, going from basics to tone curve, when I click on tone curve expands and basic collapses. This is great if you're tight on space, small monitor, laptop screen, and you don't want to have a lot of different panels open. You just want to focus on the one that you're working in. That is my little secret tip of the video, at least the secret tip so far. Now, as far as the interface goes, we do have the histogram panel open. That will always stay open unless you want to close it down by clicking on its name. I have histogram open. We can see that we have a pretty good looking histogram here. I'm not going to use the little clipping warnings here. They're not really essential, but if you're worried about your adjustments, maybe clipping, getting loss of detail in the blacks or white, you could click on these little triangles. And if you see any blue in areas where you want to have detail or any red in areas you want to have detail, that's a way to know that you've gone too far with your particular edit. And since I've already clicked on them, what the heck, let's leave them on. Now, down below you will have an interface here. We're not going to go too deep into it. These are your icons to go from, say, your editing to the crop tool to doing retouching to red eye reduction to masking. And we're going to just stick with basic editing here, and we have the basics panel open. All right. Now, in the basics panel at the very top, you have three buttons: auto, black and white, and HDR. I'm not going to cover HDR and black and white in this video, but I do want to take a moment to talk about auto. I personally have always avoided anything having the computer do anything automatic. And I know that sounds very old because we're in a world now of AI, but this is just years of reading far too much science fiction. Letting the computer make a decision has always been a bad idea in science fiction, films, or books. But I do want to say that sometimes hitting the auto button can present some very interesting, if not pleasing, results. One thing to stress is when you do this, it will make all of the changes available to you, or at least visible in the panel. So you're automatically having Lightroom guess what should be done. And you can see here that all of the settings have been made. And of course, you can modify them as much as you want. There's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong if you're in a hurry, you're in a pinch. Maybe you didn't charge enough for post-production, if at all. You need to get through this edit. Maybe auto starts you off on the right path. If not, just gives you a really good image and you can move on. That's totally up to you. But since we're talking about the basics panel completely, I'm not going to use the auto button. I'm going to go up to edit, I'll do an undo and start over again. But that's a good thing to know. Now, the next feature is profile. And this area or this feature or this setting causes a lot of confusion for those of us just starting off with Adobe Lightroom Classic. I'm going to be honest with you, it actually causes a lot of confusion for just about everybody. Essentially, what a profile is a way of establishing different standards for how saturation, contrast, lightness, darkness looks. Adobe has its own set of profiles, Adobe Color all the way down to Adobe Vivid. And when you make a change here, what is happening is you're changing that profile, that calibration, that standard, and you're getting a different look. Now, the benefit of this is you do get a better starting point. And it's important to stress that that's what the basic panel is doing. It's giving you a starting point. It's not going to get your image 100%, but it is a foundation. And the profile is the very basic part of that foundation. Now, the problem is while it can give you a really good starting point, there's no way to know how Adobe or anybody else has arrived at these settings. Meaning if they've gone too far in a certain area, which area is that and how do you back that off? Because note, unlike auto, none of these settings here have changed. They're in their default position. So it can throw people off when using this. Again, Adobe has their default profiles. Adobe Color is what you're going to get on import unless you have a import preset that changes that. In addition to Adobe's profiles, you also have camera profiles, and I have one loaded here called Camera Neutral, and I'm going to show you how to add that in a moment. But if you want to see additional profiles and really play around with that, there's two ways to do this. You can either click on this dropdown and go down to the word Browse, or you could come all the way over to the right-hand side, click on these little 4 squares, and this will open up Profile Browser, and it closes all the other panels except for the histogram panel down. Now, I'm going to collapse everything down here so it's a little bit easier to see. At the very top, it will tell you your current profile, and close will get you out of this window using whatever settings that you've decided to work with. There's an amount slider that's currently grayed out. You'll see why in a moment. Then you have a way to sort through these by seeing all of them, color profiles only, black and white profiles only, and then also change how you view those particular profiles. Going a little bit further down, you'll see the word favorites, and these are all the profiles that appear in that previous drop-down window. They're all the Adobe profiles plus the aforementioned Camera Neutral profile. If you wanted to see just the Adobe profiles, they're listed here. And an important thing to point out, as I mouse over these thumbnails, you will see the profiles actually get applied. And if you click on any of the profiles, you'll actually see the histogram change in real time, showing you what is happening to, say, the lightness and darkness values. It doesn't give you much more information than that, but at least you could see that change. Underneath Adobe RAW or Adobe's presets are camera matching. Now, these are the settings that you see on the back of your camera, those aforementioned creative styles, picture profiles, whatever that they are. And this list might be different depending on your make and manufacturer of camera than mine. So don't worry if I have more or less than you do. But these settings here are the reason why people say the following statement so much. My images don't look the same on the back of my camera as they do once I import them inside of Adobe Lightroom Classic or Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. And the reason why is because you're probably using a creative setting of, let's say, landscape. But when you import it inside of Adobe Lightroom Classic, it's using the default of Adobe Color, and you get something that looks like this. And there is a shift. It might be subtle, it might be radical, depending on what you're setting on your camera versus what Adobe Color does. Now, if you want to avoid this process, or at least this problem, is you set whatever your camera settings are, your creative style settings, to the same profile here, and the names should match up. Now, I am old school. I'm stuck in my ways. I don't want the camera or software to do anything for me. I want to do that all myself in post-production. So I shoot in neutral and I have the profile set to neutral, and my images look the same on the back of my camera screen as they do inside of the Adobe Lightroom Classic. But if you're like, why do you want to start all the way at the back? Why not have a head start? Why not use landscape? Or personally, why don't you use Adobe's landscape, which I think it looks a little bit better for this particular image? And that is a very good question. There's no right or wrong here. It just depends on how you want to start. Just know whatever profile that you use, again, you don't know what they've done to arrive at that profile. Speaking of which, if you want to even be more creative, there are artistic or creative profiles found below camera matching. There's artistic, there's black and white, and again, you could start using these. These particular profiles, once you click on them, do give you the ability to use that amount slider and reduce that amount or increase that amount depending on what you want to do. Now, again, the downside is, how do they arrive to these particular settings? How do you back them off without using the slider, or at least control part of them? That's a downside. Also, the other downside is that there's probably a lot of people that have the same look and feel to their images. But I mean, for example, if you're starting off with black and white, why wouldn't you want to start with maybe something like this? And then just tweak it from there, especially again, if you're in a particular hurry. It's very much like the auto button. It's about what you want to do. For me, I'm old school. I'm going to use camera neutral. And if you want to add any of these profiles to your dropdown list, so you don't have to go inside this window, just go to the profile, click the star in the upper right-hand corner, and it will add it to your list, and you will have that as part of your dropdown. So I'll go ahead and click neutral, have my profile set, go ahead and hit close, and I am back inside the basics panel, ready to move on. The next adjustment is white balance, and this is going to be a hotly contested thing. I could kind of feel a few comments coming my way in this section. Let me say that white balance is a total creative decision. Just like exposure, just like saturation, how warm or cool, how magenta or green you want an image is totally up to you. The only time that you really need to be scientific is if you're doing product work, or you have an art director and you want to start at the most scientific base value. But even with all the calibration in the world, with all the gray cards, white cards, color checkers, all of those kinds of things, more often than not, somebody's going to say, Can you warm that up? Can you cool that down? So white balance is really a creative thing, but you have 3 ways to change it inside of Adobe Lightroom Classic. First is the drop down. As shot will use whatever the white balance was on camera, whether you were in auto, daylight, fluorescent, tungsten, it will always have as shot with a check mark. It doesn't tell you what the white balance was. It just gives you as shot. Auto will do exactly what it sounds like. It will try to automatically figure out what the white balance will be and shift it accordingly, or not at all, depending on what's going on inside of the image. You then will have your traditional drop-down menus of daylight, cloudy, and so forth. Sometimes you'll have more or less depending on make and model of camera. I was shooting in daylight and I set to daylight on my camera. So there shouldn't be a radical difference between daylight and as shot. And I don't see any shift here, at least as I'm peering around my microphone. Now, if you wanted to fine tune this, you have 2 sliders. You have temp and tint. Temp or temperature will go from blue to yellow, and you could see the blue and the yellow here on the slider. As you drag to the left, the image will get cooler. It will become more blue. As you drag to the right, the temperature will become more yellow or warmer. So I'm going to warm this up a little bit. I'm just going to drag this just a little bit. And again, I'm peering around a microphone, and that looks okay. And I'm going to add a little bit more magenta because I'm shooting Sony and has a tendency to be a little green. So I'll bring out a little bit more of that red in the shirt and the rock here, and I'm pretty happy with that. Now, if you were trying to be more scientific or more accurate and you wanted to have the best possible white balance, you could try to find something that's black or white in the image. There's this North Face label here. It's slightly overexposed, so you have to be aware of that. If something's over or underexposed, you can't use that as a target. But if you do have something that's neutral, you could click on the eyedropper tool, come over, and I'm just going to click on the white here, and you could see with the little target that it pops up here, that it gives me a red value of 97, a green of 96.6, and a blue of 95.4. So there's a lack of blue, which means there's a little bit of yellow in here. I'll click on that. It makes that white. I'll go ahead and zoom out, and we have a much cooler image. And I still prefer what I had when I had as shot. And again, warming it up somewhere in the 6s, and then adding a little bit more magenta. Again, if you're not doing catalog work, if you're not doing hyper scientific types of things, or you need accurate calculations, use these sliders, move them around, get that white balance, because it's just as creative as any other setting inside of Lightroom. It is a creative setting. Feel free to be creative with it. Next section is tone. Tone or tonality refers to the lightness and darkness of image. Tonality has nothing to do with color. It has everything to do with brightness and darkness. You have a total of 6 sliders here. The first is exposure, and exposure is a sledgehammer. When you slide it to the right, everything gets really bright. When you slide it to the left, everything gets really dark. It's uniform. There is no subtlety to exposure, so you have to be aware of that. In this image's case, if you look at the histogram here, I don't have a really over or underexposed image. I have a lot of information in the histogram going back and forth. Please know there's not an ideal histogram, but this histogram doesn't cut off at the right. I'm not clipping any highlights, so I still have highlights and all of my bright information. And it does slightly hit over here on the left side, but you know what? That's probably these shadows in these rocks here. I'm not really concerned about those. So exposure might not be a slider that I use, but it's important to point out that if all of a sudden you do make an adjustment and you don't like it, a good feature in Adobe Lightroom Classic with any slider is if you double click on it, it will reset it to its default position. Now, in many cases, there is a debate between do you start with exposure or you jump down to highlights, shadows, whites, or blacks. In this case, because there's not a huge exposure issue, that's where I'm going to go. But even then, sometimes people will say, well, you just have an issue with the shadows or blacks, even though that increasing the exposure would brighten those up. Now you would have to go in and fix them with highlights and shadows. Why not just go to shadows and blacks? I've been using Adobe Lightroom Classic for many, many years. I can't tell you that one is better than the other. Some people start with exposure and then fine tune with highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Other people will start with those 4 settings and then fine tune with exposure. It's totally up to you. But because of the way this histogram looks, I'm going to leave exposure alone. I'm going to come into highlights and I'm just going to darken them down a little bit. Now, one thing that I highly suggest with any slider inside of Lightroom Classic is move them radically from one area to another area. See what changes with this slider. Sure, highlights are supposed to change anything that's in the mid-tone area to about, say, 85% brightness. But what does that really mean in the photo? Who knows? Slide this around, see what changes, right? You might all of a sudden be like, oh, I didn't think that that was a really bright area. This is also true of color too. Like you're changing the green grass and you find that you have to shift yellow to change the green. You don't know until you move the slider radically, move them around, see what changes. I'm going to see that a lot of the area that I think is overexposed is getting adjusted with the highlights. I'm going to bring the highlights down. I'm also then going to go to whites and do the same thing. Since I'm adjusting that, I'm going to bring the whites down a little bit as well. And by the way, because I'm peering around a microphone, don't really hit me with the aesthetics here. We're more worried about the mechanics. Shadows are the same way. I'm going to lift the shadows. And again, I'm just going to move these around and see. I'm going to lift the shadows just a little bit here. And then maybe the blacks just a bit, especially because I see that histogram touching over on that side. So I'm just going to lift those blacks just a little bit more. Now, doing this does make the image a little bit flatter. And that brings us back to the contrast slider here. Contrast is going to bring back that darkness value into the dark areas. It's going to bring lightness, brightness up as you do that as well. One thing I will say is there's better ways to do contrast inside of Adobe Lightroom Classic, specifically with the tone curve. I'm going to talk about that in another video, but there's many people who never use the contrast slider. They do everything in tone curve. But if you're in a hurry, just understand if you drag contrast to the right, you're increasing. If you drag it to the left, you're decreasing. And just about every image needs a little bit of contrast. Digital sensors sometimes have a tendency to mute that contrast. So bumping up the contrast would work. I'm going to leave it alone here for the moment because that's part of my workflow. But of course, you could play with that on your own. The last section is presence, and presence is actually broken up into two different areas. The first three sliders, texture, clarity, and dehaze, all deal with what is called mid-tone contrast. Now, we just talked about contrast. This actually does contrast a little bit differently. We'll see that in a moment. Vibrance and saturation deal with the vibrance or saturation or the vividness, how vivid the colors are or how diminutive or minute or minimal the colors are inside the particular image. Let's go back to texture, clarity, and dehaze. And I'm going to zoom in here for a second on the face of my subject here. And I'm just going to increase the texture significantly. And as I do that, you could see that there's areas of fine detail in the image that get a little bit sharper. And by the way, all that sharpness is just increasing the contrast between lightness and darkness of things that are in focus. Then it looks sharper. So as I do this, what's going to happen is fine detail is going to become sharper in the image. If you're doing portrait work, if you're doing any sort of beauty work, and you don't want really fine detail to become more pronounced, you could do a little bit of a texture reduction, and that will sometimes smooth out the skin just a touch, leaving you a little bit less time to fix that in post-production with some sort of minor flaws in skin or texture. And texture is aptly named because it is doing those fine lines. Now, clarity does exactly what texture does. It just does it to bigger lines or bigger areas. If I increase this, you could see now that things get a little bit more blocky because it's not doing fine detail. It's doing a lot of that mid-range detail here. And it's actually easier to see if I back this off. If I reduce the clarity, you get a lot of a big blurry mess. By the way, this is never a good idea to do to people's faces. For portrait work, it's very obvious. Texture is better than clarity. Clarity has a distinct look. As you start to increase it too much, it's kind of a big red flag. People will see this from a mile away, but it still has a purpose. I think it's great for outdoor photography. I think it's great for this particular image. In fact, back in the day, just 10 or 15 years ago, you had a grunge look, which was done for most industrial companies where they would increase the clarity all the way to 100 and then back the saturation off significantly. And if this was Caterpillar or Wolverine boots or Gatorade for a football ad or the NFL Network, this is about what every image looked like from about 2008 to about 2011. It was called the grunge look. And it does. It looks a little grungy there. So I'll get my saturation back to 0. And even though that I think 100% is way too much, I do think for this particular image, clarity does a pretty good job. Now, dehaze does exactly what texture and clarity does, but it doesn't do it to any sort of detail. It actually just does it to the entire image. As you increase dehaze, what's going to happen is you're going to get an increase in contrast and a significant increase in saturation. This is for images that usually are hazy. Landscape images are ideal for this. But for this particular image, I kind of get to have my cake and eat it too. I have a nice increase in contrast and I have a very nice increase in saturation here. In fact, you could make the case that maybe a vibrance or saturation modification for this image is not necessary at this particular point. Be careful though. People can go way too far with dehaze. You can see as I increase dehaze, see all this blue light up? Everything that's blue here has no detail in it because it's so contrasty that we've crushed the blacks. So always have these things turned on when you're just starting to play around with Lightroom so you're aware of those areas. You can make the case that they're unimportant, but it is important to point out that they do lose detail here. So sometimes people will go too far with dehaze. I'll leave that up to you. I'm going to double click on the arrow for it and get rid of it just because I want to talk about our last two sliders, vibrance and saturation. Now, saturation does exactly what it sounds like. It increases the vividness of the colors. If I increase it all the way, we have a nuclear canyon. If I I go all the way to 0, you have a black and white. However, never do this for black and white imagery. There's better ways to do it, but by decreasing the saturation, you do lose all of the color. Take note that the value is +8 here and it's grayed out. That's because this was part of an import preset and this is the default value for the image now. So I'll highlight it and hit 0. So we're back to 0. Now vibrance does what saturation does. It just doesn't do as heavy-handed. When I crank this all the way up, sure, it's very vivid, but it's not nuclear. It's not so heavy-handed. So a lot of times people will use vibrance far more than saturation because it's just a little bit of a more real world look. It's not so heavy-handed, it's more subtle. But if you want to get a little bit more color out of the image, you might want to increase that saturation a touch as well. Now, of course, when we look at vibrance and saturation here, it does open up the question, well, what about just using dehaze? We've seen that it does a really good job and it also gives us contrast without touching the contrast slider. This is totally up to you. This is a creative decision. The only thing that I would say is I prefer to separate my contrast adjustments from my color adjustments. And dehaze does both at the exact same time. So you might get the contrast that you want, but you might get a little too much color. And now you have to go into vibrance or saturation and try to pull that out. And you might be successful or you might struggle with it. Just depends on the image and the setting. And of course, your own personal workflow. But you know how these tools behave now and you could make those adjustments. Speaking of those adjustments, if you need to see what the adjustments look like without being applied, you have a few options. You could click the eyeball for the basics panel. Holding down the mouse button will give you a before with that panel being turned off. This is great if you have a lot of different edits going on from different panels and you want to see before and after from each panel. I really like this feature. If you need to see an overall, there's a keyboard shortcut. You could do the / key right above enter or return on your keyboard. Hit it once, that's your before. As you brought it into the program, this is your after. By going back and forth, it's like a light switch. You can also change by coming down to the bottom left-hand corner. There are before and afters here. You could click through and toggle through them, or click the arrow to the right and select a particular before and after. And if you need to go back to your regular image, click this small icon to the left. That'll go back to single screen. And of course, you could use the keyboard shortcut or the panel. It's totally up to you. Well, I hope you've liked this video. If so, please hit that like button. Please subscribe to the channel. Also, please share this with anybody who's maybe just starting off in Lightroom Classic or needs a little bit more information. Also, check out our channel for additional content. We have a lot of different videos on photo, video, and other post-production techniques and other post-production programs. And until next time, I'm MD Welch wishing you all the best from the Photo Kitchen.